Welcome to Science Matters Colorado, the podcast that explores the environmental issues shaping our beautiful state. I am your host, Alex Hippenhammer. Each episode, I talk with experts to help you understand the challenges we face and celebrate the natural wonders we strive to protect. Today, I am bringing you an episode on a highly controversial topic, the Rocky Flats National Wildlife Refuge, which was formerly the Rocky Flats Nuclear Manufacturing Site. The way this conversation came about is I recently saw a documentary at the Denver Film Festival about Rocky Flats called Half-Life of Memory. Now, this documentary was revelatory, especially for a non-local like me who knew nothing about the history of Rocky Flats before seeing the film. And today, I have the privilege of speaking to the film's director, Jeff Gipe. If you take away one thing from today's conversation, it needs to be this. Watch the film. Watch Half-Life of Memory. This documentary has interviews with plant workers, nuclear physicists, environmental scientists, the FBI agent who led the raid on Rocky Flats in the late 1980s, the public health director of Jefferson County, a local congressman, tons of archival news footage from the plant's active years, and I could go on. I mean, this is an incredibly well-researched and well-balanced film on a topic that sounds like it was lifted from an Orwell or Philip K. Dick novel. And there are heavy implications here for how we manage nuclear sites and manufacturing, which is particularly poignant right now, given the United States nuclear arms buildup. One more thing before we jump to the interview. I have no horse in this race. I started this podcast as a way to educate myself on environmental issues and to share that information with the public. I believe that we as individuals need to be able to have open-ended conversations about these issues, bringing our unique perspectives and values to the table. And the value that I heard over and over from the people who were a part of this film is actually quite simple. It is for the health and well-being of our communities. So with that, here is my conversation with Jeff Gipe. Thank you for sitting down with me today to talk about your film, Half-Life of Memory. So for people who don't know and don't have much context on Rocky Flats, can you give a brief overview of what Rocky Flats used to be?
Yeah, Rocky Flats was a nuclear weapons facility that was located in the suburbs of Denver. And at the plant, they produced an estimated 70,000 atomic bombs that were used for thermonuclear triggers. And the triggers themselves are what is most known about Rocky Flats. Most people call them triggers, or now they're called pits, have also been called buttons or cores. But essentially, it's the same make and model of the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki.
You have a personal connection to this topic. So do you mind sharing what that personal connection is and how that influenced your decision to make this film?
Yeah, so I grew up pretty close to the Rocky Flats site, just a couple of miles downwind and downstream. And my dad worked there for many years. And I was so close to it, I guess I didn't really have an impetus to question it. You know, it was kind of just normalized in a way that I, didn't think twice about it. And my dad wasn't allowed to talk about his work. So it wasn't until much later in my 20s that I began to research and understand what had happened at Rocky Flats, the incredible history about the contamination, and about what they produced. It actually wasn't until the past several years that I realized that they were actually producing atomic bombs. They generally say that they produced triggers or parts for nuclear weapons, and it sort of minimizes what they were doing out there. So when I left the area is actually when I began to dig in and research and really found it interesting that this had happened, and it kind of changed my perspective on my upbringing and my relation to it.
The language around triggers, remediation, Superfund seems intentional in terms of, as you said, to minimize what was being done there and also to maybe make it a little bit more ambiguous. What is remediation generally? Do you think that that's an intentionally ambiguous term, or is there a more technical definition that when you say something has been remediated, it does have a clear meaning?
I mean, I don't know that there actually is a word in the dictionary that describes what had happened at Rocky Flats, but it's, the term remediation sort of implies that the site has been remedied, meaning that it has been cleaned and, there's no more contamination, that it's back to where you started. Like if you were to remedy something, if you were to clean something up, you spill something on the counter, to clean it up, you clean all of that up. Sometimes you use soap and water to get it back to the state that it was at. And at Rocky Flats, they did not do that. There's not one part of Rocky Flats that is back to what they call background radiation levels. And the central operable unit where the buildings once stood, they imploded and buried what they call the most radioactively contaminated buildings in America. And on the refuge area and offsite lands, they did no remediation at all. So I think, this term remediation is troublesome for many reasons, and it's even worse when they call it clean or call it a cleanup. I think that's unfortunately really misleading, because while there was some work to make the place better, to try to make it more safe or habitable, but at most it could be called a partial cleanup or a partial remediation. And even then, like I said, there's no place on that site that is clean to background or to natural levels.
So that does add a little bit more precision to that term in terms of background radiation levels being the threshold for making a site. I don't know if that makes it hospitable for human habitation, but at least maybe recreation, which is what it's being used for now in terms of the refuge, as well as obviously a refuge for wildlife. I'm curious what impetus the DOE has to turn this site into a wildlife refuge in particular. Given your depth of research into this topic, did you come across anything that explains that decision to make this a site for maybe not human habitation at the actual site, but as a wildlife refuge and a place for recreation?
Yeah, so that decision actually came about through a process where politicians, senators, and the Department of Energy had kind of got the local governments involved and tasked them with trying to come up with a use case for Rocky Flats, meaning that the site had to have a use. So what use would these local governments and politicians want to have there? And the best use case, that Westminster was the first one to suggest this, that they came up with, was a wildlife refuge where, the wildlife could roam freely and inhabit that land. And there was also the possibility or the idea of maybe turning it into like a research facility where we would study the effects, long-term effects on animals and plants and the environment. So it was Westminster who had actually brought this idea about, but they never intended for the public to go out there, for it to be open to the public. So that was something that was a decision made by the federal government and has been implemented against the will of many local governments, and even against Governor Jared Polis, who asked for the site to at least remain closed until there could be a thorough review of the site. And so despite them trying to prevent this from happening, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, in conjunction with the Department of Energy, went ahead and opened the site, converted it to a wildlife refuge, and then opened the site to the public in 2018.
That was more recent than I realized, actually. If it was 2018, that was actually just before I moved here to Colorado. I moved here in 2019. And for a transplant like me, there's a lot of transplants that move to Colorado. The history of Rocky Flats, in terms of it being a site of a lot of protests and a lot of contention, seems to have really dissipated, which is something that the title of your film, Half-Life of Memory, captures really eloquently. Can you talk about the significance of that title, Half-Life of Memory? How does it show that tension that you're describing between how we've acted and the actual issue with the contamination right now?
The issue with turning it into a wildlife refuge is that it sort of allows us to forget the institutional knowledge of the site. And so the title is actually borrowed from an article that was written by Hannah Nordhaus in 2009. The title of the article is The Struggle to Remember the Nuclear West. And she had actually interviewed dozens of former workers and activists and people with firsthand knowledge, and then wrote this article and very eloquently spelled this out in a kind of poetic way of how it was already being forgotten at that time. That was before the refuge opened. That was just 3 years actually after the cleanup was declared complete. So even at that point, she recognized that this site and its history was being forgotten, and also understood how that was going to be sped up with the conversion of the refuge and the opening to the public. So it was a title that was borrowed from her. And Half-Life, it's sort of a play on the half-life of plutonium, which is 24,000 years. So the half-life of memory, the idea of our memories being so short, already in 2009, we were beginning to forget about this site. So it's kind of a juxtaposition of this substance, this contamination that is going to probably outlive humanity, and how short our memories are when it comes to things like this.
There's a lot of archival footage in your film which shows how many people gathered together to protest this site. And one image that sticks out in particular to me is a more recent one of protesters who are at the entrance of Rocky Flats, and they're saying to keep it closed, shut it down. And then you have bikers, I think it was, who just go right by them into the site. And I think that speaks to exactly what you're talking about in terms of the half-life of people's memories versus the institutional knowledge and the actual risk of exposure to radioactive elements and plutonium. So when you were deciding what archival footage to include and what images to show, was that intentional in terms of bringing back this sort of lived experience of people who were there, who were protesting, and showing that with the sort of current images of a wildlife refuge, which looks pretty innocuous on the surface, contrasted with all of these people? And I'll actually just show an image right now. Do you know what year this is from, or who took this photo off the top of your head?
Yeah, yeah, that was from 1980, and it was taken by Chuck David, who was a protester that was a part of the Rocky Flats Truth Force. That was a group that actually occupied the railroad tracks for over a year to try to stop shipments of nuclear waste and ultimately close the plant. So this was 1980, and there was, I think, close to 10,000 protesters then. There was 10,000 protesters the year before that, and the first large rally that they had, there was over 5,000 protesters. So it was a major issue. It was something that was on the front of people's minds. And the nuclear issue in general was huge, especially after 1979 because of the 3 Mile Island meltdown that occurred. But the first protest that happened, the first major rally that happened in 1978 was actually the largest anti-nuclear rally in the country at the time. So it grew from there, 10,000, 15,000. The encirclement in 1983, there was over 18,000 people that joined that protest. So it was something that was definitely out there. And this was a time before cell phones or internet. So it was something that people were talking about, and they were very concerned and understood the gravity of the situation at the time. Yeah, that's the 1983 protests.
So is this the encirclement that you're referring to?
Yeah, that's the
Okay.
encirclement. Protesters attempted to encircle the entire plant and nearly did, would have if people spread out, but there was a reluctance to go in the areas that they knew were more contaminated. So there was a bit of a break in the chain, but they easily could have surrounded the plant, which is 10 square miles. So it's a very large area.
Now, just for people who don't know, who maybe haven't seen Rocky Flats, is this I assume this is a pretty recent photo.
That's the north edge of the Rocky Flats site. So Rocky Flats is interesting. There's the central operable unit where the buildings once stood. And then they kept sort of expanding their area because of, contamination kept getting further and further away from the site. And so they created what they called a buffer zone that they used for security, for one, but also to try to mitigate or keep the radioactive materials that had spread from going outside of their boundaries. So it was an area that they could continue to study and analyze.
So there is a buffer zone, as you were saying earlier, from where the actual factories were demolished and I guess the rubble was all buried underground. So is that what that barbed wire fence is? That's closing off access for recreation to there, but then you can kind of recreate around it. Is that a correct understanding?
It's possible that video was shot even before you're allowed into the site. So in the film, there is some footage of inside of the actual plant area, but where the buildings once stood is still a Superfund site, which is a designation by the EPA. Some of the most highly contaminated sites in America, they designate it as a Superfund site so they could then get the funds to ideally clean it up. But it will remain, as far as I know, it will forever remain off limits to the public because of everything that was left there. Some of the most contaminated buildings in America were imploded and buried there under 3 to 6 feet of soil.
One more image that I'll share is a photo of that implosion. So this is the current Superfund site.
Correct. Yeah.
Superfund implies that there is ongoing funding to eliminate the contamination. Is that the case that you know of? Did you come across anything about future efforts to try to eliminate the plutonium waste?
They're doing mitigation, and then they're also required to continue analyzing soils, actually they're doing no soil testing, but they're analyzing contaminants in the water. But they're basically still working out there. A lot of it is just erosion control, trying to keep areas from basically being uncovered. It's a very, very windy area. And already at one point, one of the stairwells into one of the buildings had opened up because of, the water settling things and wind blowing dust around. So it's an ongoing effort to try to basically keep those contaminants in place on that part of the site.
Right. So mitigating their spread is really the interest right now of the federal, and I assume also state and local governments. I know there is interest from someone on Westminster City Council to identify, are there higher risk days when it's windier? Are there certain areas that we should be more keen on avoiding? And then there's also the issue of the extension of is it called a greenway that runs through there out towards this area of Westminster as well?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Westminster on September 23rd, they opted to pull out of an agreement that they were a part of that was going to put a pedestrian bridge across Indiana Street, which is the east side of Rocky Flats. But this pedestrian bridge is actually going to funnel people into one of the most contaminated edges of the site, known as the windblown area. And that's really concerning. And it was kind of amazing to see that Westminster stood up. And it wasn't an easy decision because the previous administration was a part of this group, was a part of the plans to go forward. And they sort of pulled out last minute, but they did extensive research, found that they thought it was still dangerous and that they didn't want the public to go in there. They understood the potential dangers of the site and really wanted to protect their citizens. So they pulled out, and it caused a big uproar. But the other groups that are involved in the federal government are pushing forward, and they're currently building that overpass right now as we speak.
Does that just mean that it won't extend all the way east to Westminster?
Yeah, so since they pulled out, I was thinking it was possibly going to end the project, but they're just like, oh, we're going to put the bridge there anyway. So it'll technically be a bridge to nowhere. Westminster, I think there's like somewhere around like a half a mile of trails that they were supposed to finish out as a part of that agreement that would connect to the Greenway, and they've decided they're not going to do that, and they've been talking about either putting signage or whether they're going to prevent people from going in there. But apparently there's already what they call a citizen trail, which is basically a citizen-made trail where people have already traveled over that way. So there won't be a concrete path, but unless they do something, there will still be access on a dirt path to that bridge.
This is getting into more recent issues with the refuge, and your film does such a great job of balancing the emotional storytelling with the political, with the environmental. Were there any interviews or interactions or moments that to you stood out as being the most conclusive evidence that this is still not a safe area for recreation, or that this is still having a detrimental effect downstream or downwind of Rocky Flats?
I think in a way it's cumulative. Everybody's story to me was really fascinating, and it's, in and of themselves, they sort of reveal these truths. But then when you look at them in context of all of the stories and all of this narrative around Rocky Flats, I think it really builds a larger picture that I think lends more credibility to each of the stories. If you were to have one person come out and say, "Oh, I saw this thing, it was crazy, it happened," it's like, okay. You might think, well, maybe it's possible. But then you hear 10 other stories that are similar, not the same story, but a similar trajectory. I think it really lends more credibility to everything that's going on. And the thing about it in filmmaking is that it's so hard because there's so much information, especially with Rocky Flats. There's a vast amount of information, and there's so many aspects to it. The science in itself it's very complex, but there's also just so much nuance to it. So, trying to balance all of that was really, really difficult because, in a film, I guess I went into it initially thinking, like, I'm going to tell the whole story of Rocky Flats. I'm really going to get into the science. I interviewed a ton of scientists, and, I started to learn that is like, okay, well, I could make 100 films about the science and probably still not cover it all and the nuances of it. And so it was really a balancing act. But I think that the most I could hope for is that it inspires people to go and do their own research and to dig into those issues. And I hope they do. I think some people will come out saying, I wish there was more science. And I think that's a great thing. Look into it. I mean, there's so much out there. It would have taken the whole film, and it would have been a very dry film to go into every bit of it. But I do hope to put out some of those interviews, and there's a lot of papers that have been written by independent scientists and even those who worked for the Department of Energy that are really fascinating that I think people should look into. I think it's some of this, what's been dismissed as anecdotal information, I think is really important, because when you hear from people who conducted the studies saying that, oh, they would just, take these core samples, which a core sample is something that's like, a $50 size, and they would go down 3 feet, and then they would take that out, mix that together, and do that I think they did it every 4 acres. This is what they based the cleanliness of the site on. And then they would mix all of that together. And so you're kind of really diluting what is there, partially because most of the plutonium contamination we know is on the surface. It came from fires and leaking barrels that were spread by the wind. So to take a core sample is already diluting these findings. And then what happened in 2019 when they found there was a sampling that was done and they found levels that were 5 times the cleanup limit, they dismissed it as an outlier. So I heard a lot from workers who would say that, like if they didn't get the reading that they wanted, they would move over a couple of feet and wait till they got the reading that they wanted. So I think we think of science as being like this baseline, like that it is truth, but there's so much that can be done with science to misrepresent what is there. And I've heard story after story how that occurred at Rocky Flats.
And at what point have you accumulated enough anecdotes to call it evidence. If you have all of these individual cases of, downstream contamination, elevating risks of cancer, or you have a few of those core samples that are quote unquote outliers that have 5 times the amount of allowable radiation. If you dismiss it a few times, I think even that seems unethical because it's there, you found it. But then, at what point does that just become evidence that it hasn't been effectively remediated? With that question of, were there any particular interviews or moments that stood out to you? I would say, it's a short film. I'm amazed at how much you got into just under an hour of actual running time. I think it's just about an hour in total. But the interview with Dr. Mark Johnson, who I can't remember exactly what his position is called.
He was the public health director for Jefferson County.
Right. So I don't want to give anything away for people who haven't seen the film, but that was a pretty persuasive point in the film, when he states his position on it, as well as John Lipsky, the FBI agent who, just the fact that you have another federal organization that is investigating and shutting down another federal institution's operations. That in and of itself is incredible. But then the fact that, he was at that screening. He was there still, not just that you interviewed him and that was an important, very persuasive part of the film, but the fact that he's still there and that he's still speaking out about it tells me a lot about what they uncovered in that investigation, whether or not he's able to share it, and just how dangerous, I guess is the word, it most likely still is for human health.
Yeah, John is amazing. He really sacrificed so much to try to spread awareness about Rocky Flats. When he did his investigation, they essentially tried to silence him and make him sign paperwork saying that there was no evidence to hold anyone accountable. And after he refused to do that, he was force transferred to Los Angeles right after the Rodney King incident that happened, and made to work on gang unit, even though he studied environmental law and ran the environmental end of the FBI in Denver. So he worked long enough out there to be able to retire, took early retirement, moved back to Colorado to essentially continue trying to get the truth out about it. And that says a lot. He sacrificed so much in his personal life, his work life, and moved his family around the country just to try to bring awareness to the issue. And, he's not paid by anyone to do this. It's something that he's very, very passionate about and wants to see justice. He's someone who really cares about justice and holding people accountable. And he felt that there was a major miscarriage of justice at Rocky Flats.
That's both great to hear about him in particular, but really difficult to hear about our institutions, where when you have someone with that much integrity leading the environmental department of the FBI and focused on environmental justice, being transferred to a different unit because they have that degree of integrity. Really sad for that institution and for the implications about, government oversight of how other government institutions are operating. But it speaks volumes about his character in particular. So you have a clip from your film that I'll share now that includes John. It also, I believe, includes one of the main voices in the film who you interview, who was a worker at Rocky Flats, Judy Padilla. So we can get a little clip of hearing it straight from them.
They were doing all sorts of illegal things that harmed the environment, that harmed the workers, that harmed the public. They contaminated the lakes, the streams, and the aquifers.
A 116-page FBI affidavit alleges improper and illegal disposal of dozens of hazardous wastes, radioactive and chemical. Wastes burned, dumped into landfills, discharged into streams. on at least 2 occasions into creeks leading to drinking water supplies for metropolitan Denver, just a few miles away.
I didn't grow up thinking that the government was going to do this to people. We're not talking about, kitchen cleaners. We're talking about the most toxic substance known to man. It was the first known search warrant served at a federal facility. They weren't going to play nice.
So in that clip, there's a red swoosh, which I think is an airstream from Rocky Flats going towards Denver and then northeast.
That's the projected contamination. And all those maps are actually from the Department of Energy. And that one is from the 1957 fire. And then the 903 pad actually spread contaminants even further all the way to southeast Denver. But that's the thing, is there really hasn't been a comprehensive study or studies to find out where these contaminants went.
Right, and that goes along with this site initially being a wildlife refuge, not for human use or recreation, so that they could do continuous research and monitoring to see how does this affect the health of wildlife, the soil. That's also research that needs to be done. What is the affected, contaminated region outside of the refuge as well?
Yeah, and the health impacts too. That's another thing that there hasn't been a deep epidemiological study or really any epidemiological study done on the health of residents who live near Rocky Flats. And there's a group called the Rocky Flats Downwinders who's working on that, trying to collect data to at least pressure the state into conducting such a study.
Right, and that gets into who should be accountable if there is an increased risk of radioactive exposure downwind of Rocky Flats in that airstream. Who should bear the cost of that? And so you said they're asking for the state to do more research for that. Is the Department of Energy implied in there anywhere? Are they asking for more remediation on behalf of the Department of Energy?
Well, so the thing is with the Department of Energy is that they're the ones that have conducted the testing, the entire operation, and continue to contract all of the studies, and they're responsible for reporting their studies, which is sort of a major conflict of interest, being that they're the ones that created the mess in the first place. But they don't do that sort of thing. Like the Department of Energy doesn't look at the impacts that they make where they've built these sites in contaminated areas. So it really isn't in their wheelhouse. And the EPA also hasn't, looked that thoroughly into the health of residents. The agency that has done the most on that end is the Colorado Department of Health. And there's a lot of issues with basically they base everything on cancer reports in the area. And they say that doesn't show an increased risk of cancer, but the studies include areas that we know some of those areas were not contaminated, and they've sort of mixed that in with areas that were contaminated. And the cancer registry only registers people who had gotten cancer and died in those areas. So, Rocky Flats, just Denver in general, there's people coming and going. It's very transient. So, it's a difficult task to do. It would be a major undertaking to try to track down people who lived in the area, where they went, what happened to them. It's a tricky thing, but I think the Downwinders in their initial survey, and they have a new survey up on their website, rockyflatsdownwinders.com. They have a new survey that they're putting out there and hoping people will contribute to, trying to just get an idea, if on their initial survey there was over 900 cases of cancer that were reported, plus many, many other issues, and many rare cancers as well. For me, that's enough to prompt a thorough look at it. But instead, the Colorado Department of Health released a sort of update to what they had in the cancer registry, including areas that were not contaminated, and said that they don't see an increased risk of cancer. So we really need someone who can independently verify, but also who is looking at the areas that we know are contaminated and trying to find these people, try to see what the real the true impact is, because the cancer registry, it doesn't give us an accurate depiction of what's going on.
It seems like there's almost a level of triage that's needed to address the different aspects of this problem in terms of the people who are living in close proximity to Rocky Flats and those neighboring communities have probably the most elevated risk of anyone. People who are using it infrequently for recreation, probably less so, but it's still there. And then people who are, miles downwind or downstream probably have the most limited risk, but then that gets exacerbated by things like, oh, we're going to build a recreation path that connects these communities directly to Rocky Flats. So it seems like as you said, federal government isn't going to be the ones to take the lead on this. And then we have issues with how the state government is handling that data. So it's up to individuals at this point, at least, and maybe also I would say, local governments as well. People who maybe they live in one of these communities that's sort of downwind, or maybe they just want to be able to recreate safely. Do you have any suggestions on how they might be able to get involved in this issue?
Yeah, I mean, so there's several groups that are working on this issue, sort of citizen activist groups that range from scientists, advocates, former workers, just a wide range of expertise. And, they could use any and all the help possible. I mean, just reaching out to your local government, that's how Westminster took that issue on, was citizens saying, hey, this is something you should look at, and got some experts in there to kind of inform them. And they had a study session, and then they decided, okay, we're going to do more research. And they went really in depth. If you look at their packet, it's like hundreds of pages long. They really did their homework, and it's not an easy thing to do. I mean, to try to decipher what is useful and not, because there's so much out there. But they took a thorough look, and it was really a grassroots level that led to that. And I think that's what's going to take is, citizens getting active. There's a group that existed prior. It's called Rocky Flats Right to Know, but it's kind of evolving into a collaboration of these groups. And the idea is to sort of give people like a landing page where they could go and say, okay, here's the different groups that are involved. Here's some basic information. Here's a list of resources. Because I think as a citizen, it's really hard to know where to start because there are several groups, and it's just like, how can I get involved? But unfortunately, there's always a new issue that arises with Rocky Flats. You would think, it's been 19 years since the cleanup was declared complete. You would kind of think, okay, well, maybe everything's quelled. But it's just like with this greenway that's happening. And in the past, it was like bringing prairie dogs into that site, which we know burrow down, and we know what's buried out there. And then another one was they wanted to do a prescribed burn. And then another one was like the landfill was slumping and starting to leach into the creeks. And very recently, some citizen scientists found that plutonium was migrating in the air. They got air samples that showed that plutonium is floating in the air out there on a windy day, as well as, some other samples that I think are going to be, I don't know if they've been released yet, but are concerning. But it really does take citizens. I mean, even if you don't have expertise, just reaching out, trying to figure out how to get involved. Like I said, it's the grassroots kind of movement, from the ground up that seems to get any push, or, there's not going to be any action happening from politicians unless there's a lot of concern from the grassroots level.
Right. And I would add to that a good place to start would be to see your film, Half-Life of Memory, for someone who wants an overview of the issue. There is, as you say, an overwhelming amount of data and information, but I think you did a great job of succinctly presenting a lot of key information in that film. So if people have the opportunity, I highly recommend checking it out. When I went it was sold out. So I had to wait for a standby ticket. And fortunately, I got in and I was able to see it and meet you. But I think that it's a great place to start because that was very impactful for my view of the issue. And I do want to echo what you said about whether it's a Congress person or whether it's city council, they really have to act according to what their constituents are telling them to act on. And I was in a meeting with a city council person just a couple of months ago where they read an email from someone who was concerned about the sustainability of new government buildings that were being built in Westminster. And this is just one person who wrote this email, and they read that email in the meeting and then, had a 15-minute discussion about it. So you might not see what's happening behind the scenes, but it does have an impact. So I would definitely echo what you said about contacting your local, council person, going to a meeting and saying you want more information about this, you want to know what's safe for you, for your children, for your neighbors. And so, yeah, I just wanted to echo that.
Yeah, and another initiative that came about from citizens is they went to the school boards around the Denver metro area, and many of the schools have since outlawed or banned school field trips to Rocky Flats. So, I mean, there's a lot of ways, and especially if you're creative, to try to get people to look into this issue. The school boards had to say, had to look into it and say, well, the federal government's saying it's safe, the state is saying it's safe, but, they got enough information that they made the decision to not allow their children to go out there, which was kind of pretty remarkable. I think over 100,000 students now are going to, I guess, be more safe, or at least not be able to traverse that while they're at school, through a school field trip or something.
So how does that work? Because we have a lot of individual school districts here in Colorado. It's just like all school children are banned from Rocky Flats. And
no, it's not all school children, but it's Denver, it's Adams County, I think it's Jefferson County. I think there's 7 different school boards that made that
probably
decision.
Westminster Public Schools, I would imagine.
Yeah, I don't know what school district they fall under, but I'm pretty sure that they're included in that.
But it sounds like all the big ones, like you just named.
Yeah.
Several of the biggest school districts in Colorado. Okay. So I know that I don't have a lot of knowledge about this, but I know that there's potentially a nuclear arms buildup that's going to happen in the U.S. over the next couple of years, starting within the next couple of years. And it seems like you are, continuing to stay involved in this issue with a very personal and specific understanding of how this impacts local communities, but also a broader view, sort of, nuclear arms and manufacturing. Do you have concerns about the pending nuclear arms buildup, about our reliance on nuclear energy at all, and what that means in terms of public health and environmental conservation?
Yeah, I mean, it's deeply concerning at Rocky Flats when you look back on the track record. I mean, even before the 1969 fire, there was over 400 plutonium fires that were reported to the fire department there at Rocky Flats. And plutonium is just very unstable. And so it's not even pending. There is a nuclear buildup. We're in essentially another arms race right now. And they diamond stamped the first plutonium pit to come from the Los Alamos National Laboratory just a couple of months ago. And so what that is, the pit is what they built at Rocky Flats. They called the trigger at Rocky Flats. They're now calling them pits. But they built a whole new facility at Los Alamos, and they're working on getting another facility going in South Carolina. What's interesting is the day before they put out this news release that they diamond stamped their first pit, there was a lawsuit where the judge found in favor of the plaintiffs, basically saying that the government didn't do its due diligence. The environmental impact statement didn't take into account how it's going to affect the environment or people in the area. And so it's interesting. It's basically starting again. This is a Rocky Flats #2 and soon to be a Rocky Flats #3. Rocky Flats was the central facility, aside from the couple of bombs that were produced back in the 40s at Los Alamos. Rocky Flats produced all of them. And so it's deeply concerning because that ended in 1989 when the FBI raided Rocky Flats. I believe that the Cold War was largely ended because Rocky Flats was closed. I mean, there's a lot of nuance there too. There was a lot that fed into that, but they tried for many years after the FBI raid to reopen Rocky Flats and to continue building plutonium pits. And they couldn't do it. There was finally environmental laws, and there was just no way that they could safely operate this, and never could in the first place. But there was now environmental laws that said you have to stay within these guidelines, and so they couldn't do it. So they eventually had to decide they were going to close and clean it up. But had that not happened, I mean, we would have remained in a Cold War. We would have remained in an arms race where we're producing these weapons. And at Rocky Flats, I think there was 5 a day, 7 days a week that they were producing. So what they're doing right now is they're trying to ramp that up. There's a law that by 2030 they have to be producing 80 plutonium pits per year. That has already spurred an arms race across the world where every nuclear nation is now saying, okay, well, the US is producing weapons. We need to produce more weapons. So Russia has ramped up nuclear production, China, North Korea, obviously. And now there's seven nuclear states instead of just 2 that we had in the Cold War. So it's an arms race that's getting more and more out of control, and more likely that something, even if by accident, could happen to cause a major catastrophe that could, I mean, it's possible that nearly all human life could be extinct. I mean, it's with the amount of weapons that are out there, and if something were to go wrong, it could eliminate nearly all humans on Earth, which is very concerning. Also concerning what's happening with the people that live in those areas downwind, and converting Rocky Flats into a wildlife refuge allowed everyone to forget what happened, and it's been a sort of pitched as a success story. Like, yeah, we did all of this and there were some issues, but now it's a refuge, so everything is fine. So it allowed people to sort of forget all that's happened. And I fear that younger people don't understand the implications of that. You were showing some photos earlier of protesters and how many people were there and just invested in this issue. Today, unfortunately, we're not seeing that at all. And I would say that most people don't know that we're in a new arms race. So it's a conundrum, and I just hope that there's more information, that, there needs to be a lot more education around it, essentially. And I really hope that one day maybe they'll, teach these issues in school.
The thing that we fear is this nuclear catastrophe, which, of course, yeah, if we're having a nuclear arms race and we have these international conflicts, then that makes sense. But we're not thinking about the actions we're taking right now and how it's affecting us right now, and looking to history to inform what we're doing right now. Rocky Flats being a part of that history, just that intersection isn't something I think people are really aware of when dealing with nuclear weapons manufacturing, that the fallout doesn't just happen after the bomb goes off. The fallout is happening throughout that entire process. And Rocky Flats is evidence of that. Judy Padilla is evidence of that. The other workers that you interview, or the Rocky Flats downwinders, are evidence of that. So that fallout is happening throughout the entire process. It's not just, if and when a bomb does explode that it happens. And that says a lot about, our awareness of the actions that we're taking every day. They are going to lead to some consequences. And so if those actions are a nuclear deterrent, if that's what you're focused on as a country, then yeah, that's going to impact public health. That's going to impact the environment. It's not just, these bombs don't just come out of nowhere and then, land over some dictator in a foreign country and have zero side effects on the country where they're manufactured. There's a history to that. And there's a community where that's happening, and there's people that are in those factories. So yeah, thank you for bringing light to that side of this issue.
Yeah, and that's something that, the initial activists out at Rocky Flats did a great job of bringing that about, and I think that's why there was so much public concern. They put out a booklet that was called Local Hazard, Global Threat, that kind of went into all of that, because everyone was concerned about the global threat of a nuclear catastrophe, but nobody really understood that we're essentially contaminating ourselves, bombing ourselves in a sort of sense that, these contaminants are spread all over the United States. It's not just at Rocky Flats. There's many other facilities that help produce nuclear weapons and also nuclear power. I mean, it was a major issue around the same time back in the late 70s and early 80s that has now sort of been forgotten. And now everyone is thinking about the greatness that could happen from that free, clean energy. And that's how we're going to solve all of our issues. But nobody's talking about the waste that's produced and the ongoing disasters at Fukushima and Chernobyl and what happened at 3 Mile Island. And, now they're talking about reopening 3 Mile Island for powering data centers. I think it's Bill Gates maybe that wants to do that. And it's very concerning because it's just like, okay, you waited, 20 years for people to forget all of what took so long for us to finally understand. And then now we're just jumping back into it head first. It's really concerning, especially because there's no repository. There's no long-term repository for nuclear waste at all right now. So this stuff is either being shipped around the country or sitting in pools where these facilities are. And, with the environment the way that it is and unexpected things happening all the time with flooding and fires, it's only a matter of time before there's another major catastrophe like 3 Mile Island, like Fukushima, like Chernobyl. So it is concerning. It's something we definitely need to be aware of. And when we move forward with nuclear power and especially nuclear weapons, I think are, it's sort of an evil. It's something that, unfortunately, we open Pandora's box and it doesn't seem like we're going back, but it's just spreading further and further with 7 nuclear armed countries right now. And some of them being very unstable. It's hard to see how this wouldn't end in some sort of disaster.
You're really in the thick of it right now in terms of, you just had your screening at the Denver Film Festival, and then you're traveling across the country, going to different conventions on this topic. Do you think you'll stay focused on nuclear manufacturing and the fallout of that? Or do you see something else in your future in terms of doing a documentary on a different topic?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to focus on something else, but unfortunately, there's sort of few of us who are involved in this. And when you realize that this is an issue that's going to have to be passed down, not from one generation to the next, but for thousands of generations, grappling with that and trying to just raise awareness one generation into it, how much we've already forgotten. And the Rocky Flats issue is so vast. I just would love to work on something else, but I've got at least a couple of more film projects in the works, and I'm always working on other things around Rocky Flats. It's something that's very close to me, but is also something that I feel like if I were to turn away from, I would have some guilt about that at this point, knowing what I know and knowing the state that we're in with everything right now.
Well, it's not an easy subject to be focused on. So thank you for doing that work and bringing it to people's attention. For people who are interested in seeing your film, can you point them to where they might be able to find it, and also someplace they can learn more about your work? Because you said you have some other films coming out in the future on Rocky Flats and this issue.
Yeah, so there will be more local screenings soon. There's 2 of them that are planned. One will be at the Colorado Environmental Film Festival at the end of February. And then there will be a screening in Boulder at the Dairy Arts Center on February 2nd. There's a couple more in the works, but those are the ones that are planned out so far. And there will also be streaming for the film available sometime early next year. Whenever I get the details for that, I'll share all of that on the website, which is halflifeofmemory.com, no dashes or spaces. And yeah, and so through that, you can find my contact info. I also have a web page for visual art, but I'll update that as well and try to update the new projects when I get to a point of sharing that and getting that out there.
I'll also link information on where to buy tickets to those future screenings in your website in the show notes. So if people want to just go to the show notes, you can access those links directly from there. Jeff, thank you for taking the time to talk to me about this issue. I really enjoyed your film, and I really hope that a lot of people go see it and all your future screenings sell out as well, because it packs quite a punch for just an hour of screen time. And I can tell you really put your heart into it, and it was enlightening for me to see. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for doing this and, trying to help spread awareness. It's something that way too few people know. And, especially since you were a transplant to Colorado, I'm sure it was kind of a new and an eye-opening experience. But I think it's similar for many younger people as well. So I just hope that, my goal is that everybody in the area has a chance to see the film. There will be more screenings, and we'll try to have free screenings, and there will be meetings, and it'll be streaming as well. But yeah, I think that if people want to get involved, it would be great to have anyone's help, whatever area of expertise they have or none. Just getting the word out and kind of making a little noise can go a long ways.
Awesome. I second that. All right. Thank you, Jeff.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Alex.
If you enjoyed today's episode and found it insightful, please share it with your friends and family. A special thank you to the Denver Film Festival and C Film Center for screening Half-Life of Memory and spreading awareness on this important topic. The music for this podcast is Siesta by Ixon, part of the Tell Your Story Project, a library of free music for content creators. Visit ikson.com to explore the full catalog.